For 5 consecutive years, Burt Reynolds was the absolute center of the Hollywood universe. The highest paid star on the planet, the man every woman wanted and every man wanted to be. But the mustache, the toupee, and the swagger were merely a suit of armor designed to protect a shattered child. The Burt Reynolds the world fell in love with was a magnificent deception. Behind the wheel of the Trans Am sat a man crippled by a desperate need for approval, an actor who systematically sabotaged his own genius, and a son who spent 60 years bleeding from invisible wounds. This is not just the story of a movie star, it is the autopsy of a man who conquered the world, only to lose it all because he was terrified of who he was when the cameras stopped rolling. Before the lights of Hollywood, before the centerfolds and the high-speed chases, there was only the humid, oppressive heat of the American South, and a boy named Burton Leon Reynolds Jr. Born into a world where emotions were considered a defect, Burton was born in Lansing, Michigan in 1936, but his soul was forged in the swamps of Florida. His father, Burton Sr., was the police chief of Riviera Beach, a man cut from the same cloth as the Old Testament God, distant, terrifying, and absolute. The chief was a war hero, a man of law and order who viewed affection as a weakness. He ruled the house with a silence that was louder than shouting. Young Burton grew up in the long, cold shadow of this man, starving for a crumb of validation. He would later recall that in his entire life, he could count the number of times his father told him, "I love you," on 0 hands. This emotional starvation created a vacuum in the boy's heart, a void that he would spend the next 7 decades trying to fill with applause, women, and fame. But in the 1950s, his strategy was simpler. He would become a weapon. If he couldn't be loved for his softness, he would be respected for his hardness. He turned to football. Football was not a game to Reynolds. It was a blood ritual. On the field, the rage and the hurt could be channeled into kinetic energy. He was a fullback, a position that requires one to run headfirst into a wall of human bodies. He played with a suicidal intensity, earning the nickname Buddy, and eventually landing a scholarship to Florida State University. The path seemed clear. He would be a professional athlete. He would be a hero. He would finally make the chief look at him with pride. But destiny is a cruel author, and it often writes its plot twists in the sound of snapping bone. In his sophomore year, during a game that has long since faded from the record books, Reynolds was hit. The sound of his knee disintegrating was the sound of his identity shattering. In an instant, the future he had built was gone. A subsequent car accident, which cost him his spleen and further damaged his other knee, hammered the final nail into the coffin. Lying in a hospital bed, staring at the sterile white ceiling, Reynolds faced the first of many existential deaths. He was no longer a football player. To his father, he was now damaged goods, a broken machine. The shame of that failure, the feeling of being physically inadequate, would haunt him forever. It instilled in him a fear of fragility that would later compel him to perform his own stunts, to jump from helicopters and crash cars, destroying his body over and over again, just to prove he was still a real man. It was into this abyss of depression that an unlikely savior appeared. His name was Watson B. Duncan III, an English teacher at Palm Beach Junior College. Duncan was the first man in Reynolds' life who saw value in his voice, not just his muscles. He looked at the brooding, angry ex-jock and saw a reservoir of untapped pain. He handed Reynolds a copy of a play and told him to read. When Reynolds stepped onto the stage for the first time, something alchemical happened. He wasn't acting. He was exercising. The emotions he had suppressed to survive his father's house, the grief, the longing, the rage, poured out of him. He realized that on stage he could cry and people would applaud. It was a revelation. It It was a drug more potent than adrenaline. Encouraged by Duncan, and perhaps driven by a need to escape the judgmental gaze of his father, Reynolds headed for New York. But the road to stardom was paved with a specific kind of humiliation that Reynolds was uniquely ill-equipped to handle. New York, in the late 1950s, was the kingdom of the method. Actors like James Dean and Paul Newman were redefining the craft. But there was one shadow that loomed larger than all others: Marlon Brando. Brando was the god of the era, the brooding genius in the torn t-shirt. And unfortunately for Burt Reynolds, he looked exactly like him. It is a strange curse to be born with the face of the most famous man in the world. Reynolds had the same brooding eyes, the same heavy brow, the same simmering sexuality. Casting directors would take one look at him and sigh. "We already have a Brando," they would say. "We don't need a copy." The resemblance was so uncanny that it became a professional roadblock. Reynolds walked into auditions and saw the interest drain from the producer's eyes the moment he spoke. He was dismissed as a budget Brando, a discount Marlon. He auditioned for the film Sayonara, a massive production that could have launched his career. He was perfect for the role. The director wanted him, but the studio executives killed it. Their reasoning was brutal. "No one will believe he isn't Brando's brother. He looks too much like the star." To make matters worse, Brando himself was aware of the resemblance, and he hated it. The great actor viewed Reynolds not as a flattering imitator, but as a parasitic annoyance. Brando would later be recorded saying that Reynolds made him want to vomit, calling him the epitome of everything wrong with Hollywood, a narcissist who worshipped his own reflection. Reynolds, who idolized Brando, was crushed by the disdain of his hero. He was being punished for a face he didn't choose. Desperate for work, Reynolds took whatever scraps the industry threw at him. He washed dishes, he drove delivery trucks. He worked as a bouncer using his football size to throw drunks out of dance halls. He lived in cheap boarding houses, eating cold beans, staring at the neon signs of Broadway, wondering if he had made a mistake. He was a man with a movie star face and empty pockets. But hunger is a powerful motivator, and Reynolds possessed a stubborn streak inherited from the chief. He began to scrape his way into television. The medium was young, hungry for content, and less discerning than the silver screen. In the late 50s, he landed a contract with Universal Studios. It was a factory job. He was a piece of meat on an assembly line, thrown into westerns and riverboat dramas to look pretty and throw punches. His first major break came with the series Riverboat in 1959. He was cast as Ben Fraser, the young, handsome pilot alongside the star Darren McGavin. It should have been the start of a glorious ascent. Instead, it was a disaster of ego and immaturity. Reynolds, insecure and defensive, clashed instantly with McGavin. He felt the older actor was condescending. He hated the scripts, which he felt reduced him to eye candy. He hated the direction. He hated the lack of respect. The chief's son inside him rebelled against authority. After only 20 episodes, in a move of breathtaking stupidity, he quit. He walked away from a hit network show. In Hollywood, this is a cardinal sin. You can be untalented, you can be drunk, but you cannot be difficult. Reynolds was branded as trouble. The phone stopped ringing. He had torched his own lifeboat in the middle of the ocean. For the next 2 years, he wandered the wilderness of Hollywood. He was unhireable. He had a reputation as a quitter with a bad attitude. He survived on guest spots, playing villains and heavies, the generic bad guy who gets shot in the third act. It was during this low point in 1963 that he accepted a role in The Twilight Zone. The episode was titled The Bard, and Reynolds was cast as Rocky Rhodes, a temperamental, mumbling method actor. It was a parody. Specifically, it was a parody of Marlon Brando. Reynolds played the role with a vicious, mocking accuracy. He mimicked Brando's tics, his scratching, his mumbling. It was a brilliant performance, but it was also an act of petty revenge. It was Reynolds laughing back at the man who despised him, but it also cemented the comparison. He was effectively telling the world, yes, I am the other Brando. While his career was flailing, his personal life was beginning to exhibit the chaotic patterns that would define his future. In 1963, seeking stability, he married British actress Judy Carne. It was a union born of loneliness rather than compatibility. Reynolds wanted a home. He wanted someone to come back to, but he didn't know how to be a husband. He was moody, driven, and financially unstable. The marriage lasted less than 2 years. When it dissolved in 1965, it devastated him. He later admitted, "She broke my heart." The failure of the marriage reinforced his deep-seated belief that he was unlovable. He threw up emotional walls. He decided that if he couldn't sustain a relationship, he would simply consume them. He began to treat romance like a sport, a game he could win, but never enjoy. By the mid-1960s, Reynolds was drifting. He was approaching 30, an age where the young hunk roles start to dry up. He needed a miracle. That miracle arrived on horseback. The producers of Gunsmoke, the biggest show on television, were looking for a new character to replace Dennis Weaver. They needed someone who could play a half-breed blacksmith named Quint Asper. It was a gritty, serious role. They looked at Reynolds. They saw the darkness in his eyes, the physical imposition of the former football player. They hired him. Gunsmoke was the rehabilitation of Burt Reynolds. For 3 years, he showed up on time. He learned his lines. He watched the stars, James Arness and Milburn Stone, and he learned the discipline of the craft. He realized that acting wasn't just about emotion. It was about reliability. He became a professional. Fans began to respond to him. They liked the brooding blacksmith. They liked the way he moved. For the first time, Reynolds felt the ground solidify beneath his feet. He was no longer just a Brando copy. He was Quint Asper. He was somebody. But Reynolds was not a man who could sit still. The ambition that burned in his gut was a restless fire. After 3 seasons, against the advice of everyone in the industry, he left Gunsmoke. He declared that he was a movie star, even if the movies didn't know it yet. He packed his bags and headed for the desert of spaghetti westerns and B-movies, chasing a stardom that seemed always just out of reach. He filmed Navajo Joe in Spain, a movie he later claimed was so bad it was only shown in prisons and airplanes because no one could leave. He was hustling, grinding, taking checks, and waiting for the moment when the world would finally see him, not as a shadow, not as a quitter, but as the king. He didn't know it yet, but the 1960s were just the prologue. The era of the nice guy was ending. The era of the bandit was about to begin. But before he could wear the crown, he would have to navigate a river that would strip him bare and a centerfold that would nearly destroy him. As the decade turned, Burt Reynolds stood on the precipice of the 1970s, a man with a broken knee, a broken heart, and a smile that was about to fool the entire world. By 1970, Burt Reynolds was a man possessed by a peculiar kind of desperation. He was 34 years old, a dangerous age in Hollywood, where the line between up and coming and has-been is razor thin. He had the face, he had the body, and he had the resume of a journeyman who had survived the trenches of television westerns and B-grade action flicks. But he was missing the one thing that separates the actors from the icons: a voice. For a decade, he had been trying to be someone else. He had tried to be Brando. He had tried to be Clint Eastwood. He had scowled, mumbled, and punched his way through scripts that weren't worth the paper they were typed on. But the world didn't need another cowboy. The 1970s were dawning, and the culture was shifting. The stoic silence of the John Wayne era was being replaced by a need for vulnerability, for wit, for a man who could take a punch and laugh about it. It was in the sterile, air-conditioned studio of The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson that Burt Reynolds finally found himself. It happened almost by accident. Invited as a guest to plug a forgettable movie, Reynolds realized he had nothing to lose. Instead of playing the serious actor, he dropped the mask. He leaned back in the chair, flashed that devastating, self-deprecating grin, and started making fun of himself. "I'm the only movie star in the world," he quipped to Carson, "who hasn't got a movie." The audience roared. It was a revelation. Here was a man who looked like a Greek god, but talked like a regular guy at a bar. He was funny. Not scripted funny, but dangerously, spontaneously funny. He was charming, slightly lewd, and impossibly likable. Overnight, Reynolds became the king of the talk show circuit. He didn't need a script. He was the show. He realized that his greatest character wasn't Quint Asper or Ben Fraser. It was Burt Reynolds. This newfound confidence unlocked a door to a world he had previously only glimpsed from a distance. And walking through that door was a woman who would change his life, Dinah Shore. The romance between Burt Reynolds and Dinah Shore remains one of the most fascinating and tender chapters in Hollywood history. It was a scandal on paper. Shore was the darling of American television, a refined Southern Belle talk show host. She was also 54 years old. Reynolds was 34. In 1971, a 20-year age gap where the woman was older was practically a social crime. The tabloids went feral. They called him a gigolo. They called her desperate. But the reality was far quieter and more profound. Reynolds, the man who had grown up with a father colder than ice, found in Shore a warmth that thawed his frozen heart. She was sophisticated, maternal, and fiercely intelligent. She didn't need his money. She had plenty of her own. She didn't need his fame. She was already a legend. For the first time in his life, Reynolds was with a woman who just wanted him. "I've never been with anyone," Reynolds later confessed, "who asked for nothing." They became the unlikeliest it couple of the era. He would lie with his head in her lap at parties, listening to her play the piano. She grounded him. She taught him which fork to use at fancy dinners. But more importantly, she taught him that he was worthy of love without having to perform for it. Under her influence, the angry young man began to soften. He began to believe he could be a serious artist. And just as his heart was finding its rhythm, his career was offered a lifeline that would either drown him or immortalize him. The script was called Deliverance. It was a dark, brutal story about 4 city men who take a canoe trip down a fictional river in Georgia and encounter a nightmare of hillbilly violence and survival. The director was John Boorman, a visionary who wanted raw authenticity. He didn't want polished stars. He wanted men who looked like they could bleed. Reynolds was cast as Lewis Medlock, the alpha male of the group, a survivalist and archer, a man obsessed with his own virility. It was the role Reynolds had been born to play. Lewis was the exaggerated version of everything Reynolds thought he had to be: tough, invincible, and in control. The production of Deliverance was not a movie shoot. It was a descent into hell. Boorman decided to film the actors doing their own stunts on the Chattooga River, a treacherous, violent waterway that had never been tamed. There were no CGI effects. There were barely any safety regulations. Reynolds, driven by his need to prove his toughness, threw himself into the physical danger with a reckless abandon. In one scene, his character had to go over a waterfall. The production had a dummy prepared. Reynolds looked at the dummy, floating limply in the water, and asked Boorman, "It looks fake, doesn't it?" "It looks like a dummy," Boorman admitted. "I'll do it," Reynolds said. He climbed into the canoe. He paddled toward the edge of the falls. As the water took him, the canoe capsized and Reynolds was sucked into a hydrovortex at the bottom of the falls. The force of the water tore his clothes off. He was trapped underwater, his lungs burning, stripped naked, tumbling against the rocks. He later said that in those 30 seconds he made peace with death. When the river finally spit him out, he was battered, bruised, and he had cracked his coccyx, tailbone. The pain was blinding. But when he dragged himself onto the muddy bank, looking up at the terrified crew, he asked, "How did it look?" "It looked like a dummy falling over a waterfall," Borman deadpanned. Reynolds laughed, but the damage was done. That injury, the cracked tailbone, would plague him for decades. It was the beginning of a dependency on painkillers that would eventually spiral into a harrowing addiction. He had sacrificed his body for the shot, but the sacrifice seemed worth it. When Deliverance was released in 1972, it was a masterpiece. Critics who had dismissed Reynolds as a lightweight were suddenly comparing him to Brando, not as a copy, but as a peer. His performance was visceral, terrifying, and tragic. He was the anchor of the film. The industry buzz was deafening. Burt Reynolds was going to get an Oscar nomination. He had finally earned the respect of the serious actors. And then, in a moment of supreme hubris, he threw it all away for a laugh. While promoting the film, Reynolds was approached by Helen Gurley Brown, the editor of Cosmopolitan magazine. She had a radical idea. She wanted a male centerfold, not a pornographic image, but a cheeky, sexy pinup that would subvert the Playboy tradition. She wanted Burt Reynolds, high on his own supply of charm and drunk on the talk show applause, thought it would be hilarious. "It's a goof," he told himself. "It's a send-up." One afternoon, fueled by several glasses of vodka, he walked onto a set, stripped off his clothes, and lay down on a bearskin rug. He held a cigar in one hand and placed the other strategically between his legs. He flashed that trademark, smart-ass grin at the camera. Click. When the magazine hit the stands in April 1972, the world exploded. It sold out instantly. 1.5 million copies vanished from shelves. Women went wild. Burt Reynolds was now officially the biggest sex symbol on the planet. He was a phenomenon. But in Hollywood, the silence was chilling. The serious actors, the De Niros, the Pacinos, the Academy voters, looked at the naked man on the bearskin rug and sneered. They didn't see a sense of humor. They saw a clown. They saw a man who didn't respect the craft. How could they vote for Lewis Medlock, the tragic survivor of Deliverance, when the actor playing him was showing off his chest hair in a women's magazine? The Oscar nomination never came. Reynolds waited by the phone. He had prepared a speech. He had bought a suit. But the silence stretched on. He had traded immortality for a moment of viral fame. He later called it one of the biggest regrets of his life. "I was just being a smartass," he said decades later, the bitterness still coating his tongue. "I didn't know they would take it so seriously." The snub broke something in him. It reinforced the voice of the chief in his head. "You are not a serious man. You are a joke." If the industry wouldn't respect him as an artist, he decided he would make them pay him as a star. He pivoted. He turned his back on the dark, gritty dramas and embraced the blockbuster. He reunited with director Robert Aldrich for The Longest Yard in 1974. Returning to the football field was a poetic, painful closing of a circle. Playing Paul Crewe, a disgraced quarterback forced to lead a team of prisoners against the guards, Reynolds was essentially playing himself, a fallen hero seeking redemption through violence. The physicality of the role was brutal. He was nearly 40, playing a contact sport against real athletes. He broke ribs. He suffered concussions. He poured his physical agony into the role. The Longest Yard was a smash hit. It cemented his status as the alpha male of the 70s. He was unstoppable. He was making movies back-to-back, White Lightning, Gator, WW, and the Dixie Dance Kings. He was the good old boy icon, drifting cars and punching sheriffs. But while his career was soaring into the stratosphere, his relationship with Dinah Shore was quietly suffocating. The issue, as it always is with time, was the future. Reynolds wanted a child. He wanted to be the father that his own father never was. He wanted to correct the mistakes of the past. Shore, at nearly 60, could not give him that. She loved him enough to let him go. The breakup was devastatingly civil. There were no screaming matches, no thrown vases. Just a quiet conversation in a beautiful living room where two people who adored each other acknowledged that love is not always enough to bridge the gap of biology. Reynolds packed his bags and left the only safe harbor he had ever known. He was alone again. He was richer than God, more famous than the president, and the most desired man in America. But he was entering the second half of the decade with a hole in his chest and a chip on his shoulder. He had tried to be the serious actor, and they had laughed at him. He had tried to be the family man, and time had robbed him. So Burt Reynolds made a choice. If the world wanted a clown, he would be the biggest, fastest, most charming clown they had ever seen. He would stop chasing Oscars and start chasing cars. Hal Needham was coming, along with a black Trans Am and a script barely 20 pages long, and when Burt slid behind that wheel as the Bandit, he'd hit the summit so fast he wouldn't notice the air thinning until it was already gone. In a dusty storage unit in Florida, years after the money had dried up, a box of magazines was found. Inside was a pristine copy of Cosmopolitan, April 1972. The paper was yellowing, but the image was vibrant. There he was, lying on the rug, the cigar in his hand, the smile on his face. It was the smile of a man who thought he was in on the joke. Looking at it now, it feels less like a pinup and more like a crime scene photo. The exact moment a promising artistic life was murdered by the seduction of celebrity. He surely looked at that photo in his later years and wondered, was it worth it? The silence of the empty trophy shelf was the only answer he ever got. By 1977, America was suffering from a crisis of confidence. The Vietnam War had ended in a humiliating withdrawal. The Watergate scandal had shattered trust in the presidency, and the economy was stagnating in a malaise of gas shortages and inflation. The country was tired. It was cynical. It needed a release valve. It didn't need a moral lecture or a complex anti-hero. It needed a party. And Burt Reynolds, sensing the frequency of the national mood with the instinct of a carnival barker, decided to throw the biggest party in history. He found his vehicle, literally and metaphorically, in a script that was barely a script. It was scrawled on legal pads by his best friend Hal Needham. Needham was not a writer, nor was he a director. He was the greatest stuntman alive, a man who had broken 56 bones in his body and lived on a diet of painkillers and adrenaline. He came to Reynolds with an idea: a bootlegger, a runaway bride, a sheriff, and a semi-truck full of Coors beer. The studio executives hated it. They called it trash. They said it was a B-movie chase flick that would die at the drive-ins. But Reynolds saw something they didn't. He saw the CB radio craze sweeping the nation. He saw the Southern pride bubbling under the surface. And most importantly, he saw a chance to stop acting and start playing. "I'll do it," Reynolds said, "but only if I can have fun." That movie was Smokey and the Bandit. The production was chaotic, fueled by improvisation and a sense of anarchic joy. Reynolds wasn't playing a character anymore. He was playing the Burt Reynolds persona turned up to 11. He put on the red shirt. He put on the cowboy hat. And he slid behind the wheel of a black 1977 Pontiac Trans Am, a car that was less a machine and more a prosthetic extension of his own virility. But a hero needs a damsel, even if the damsel is the one doing the saving. Casting the female lead was a gamble. Reynolds wanted Sally Field. At the time, Sally Field was known as the Flying Nun. She was cute, she was wholesome, and she was considered a television sitcom actress with zero sex appeal. The studio fought Reynolds. She's not sexy, they argued. Nobody wants to see the nun in a Trans Am. Reynolds stood his ground. He had admired Field from afar. He saw a spark in her, a fierce intelligence hidden behind the girl next door eyes. When they met on set, the chemistry wasn't just palpable, it was nuclear. He called her Frog because of the way she hopped around. She looked at him, this preening, hairy-chested peacock of a man, and saw the frightened boy hiding underneath. He gave me a feeling that I was sexy, Field later recalled, and I wanted to be everything he wanted. For Reynolds, falling in love with Sally Field was a terrifying loss of control. He was used to starlets, to fleeting flings, to women who served as accessories to his lifestyle. Field was different. She challenged him. She made him think. For a brief, shining moment, the bandit let his guard down. The scenes in the movie where they are talking in the car, those weren't scripted. That was two people falling in love in real time, captured on 35mm film. When Smokey and the Bandit opened in May 1977, it didn't just perform, it exploded. It became the second highest grossing film of the year, losing only to a space opera called Star Wars. But in the heartland of America, Smokey was king. It changed the culture. Sales of Trans Ams skyrocketed. The CB radio became the iPhone of the 70s, and Burt Reynolds became the #1 box office star in the world. He held that title for 5 consecutive years. From 1978 to 1982, no human being on Earth sold more movie tickets than Burt Reynolds. He was bigger than Eastwood, bigger than Redford, bigger than Nicholson. He was a god. But godhood is a dangerous thing for a man with low self-esteem. The massive success of Smokey validated Reynolds' worst instincts. He stopped listening to the critics who wanted him to do serious work. Why suffer for art when you can crash cars and make millions? He retreated into a comfort zone that became a fortress. He surrounded himself with an entourage of yes men, old football buddies and stuntmen who laughed at his jokes and drank his liquor. He bought a massive ranch in Florida, a private jet, a helicopter. He lived like a feudal lord, dispensing favors and holding court. This era, the imperial era, was defined by a tragic paradox. The more famous he got, the smaller his world became. He began to believe his own hype. He believed that he was the movie and that the script didn't matter. This arrogance led to a series of career decisions that are now legendary for their stupidity. It is a list of what-ifs that haunts the history of cinema. In the late 70s, George Lucas approached Reynolds to play Han Solo in Star Wars. Reynolds turned it down. "I didn't want to play a guy in a vest alongside a walking carpet," he joked later. But the truth was simpler. He didn't understand it, and he was too comfortable being the bandit to take a risk on a sci-fi fairy tale. Harrison Ford took the role and the icon status that came with it. Then, the producers of James Bond came calling. Sean Connery had stepped aside. They wanted an American Bond. They wanted Burt. It would have changed the perception of his career instantly. Reynolds turned it down. "An American can't play James Bond," he said. "It just wouldn't work." It was a moment of false humility that masked a deep fear of failure. He was afraid to step into Connery's shoes, so he stayed in his cowboy boots. He turned down the role of the astronaut in terms of endearment, a role written for him. Jack Nicholson took it and won an Oscar. He turned down Pretty Woman. Reynolds was systematically dismantling his own future, rejecting the roles that would have allowed him to age gracefully, in favor of making Smokey and the Bandit 2, the Cannonball Run, and Stroker Ace. He was churning out car crash porn, movies that were indistinguishable from one another. The audience was laughing, but the laughter was beginning to sound hollow. Meanwhile, at home, the fairy tale with Sally Field was turning into a nightmare. While Reynolds was stagnating in his fast cars, Sally Field was evolving. She was hungry. She wanted to be a great actress. She fought for the lead role in Norma Ray, a gritty drama about a union organizer. It was the antithesis of a Burt Reynolds movie. Reynolds was unsupportive. He told her the script was boring. He told her nobody wanted to see a movie about a textile mill. But beneath the dismissal lay a festering jealousy. He saw her growing wings, and he was terrified that she would fly away. When Field won the Academy Award for Best Actress for Norma Ray in 1980, it was the moment of truth. The nun had become the queen. And where was the king? Burt Reynolds refused to attend the ceremony. He claimed he was busy. He claimed he had a schedule conflict. But the truth was ugly and undeniable. He could not bear to stand in the audience and clap while his girlfriend achieved the one thing he had always secretly wanted but never earned: the respect of his peers. He stayed home, nursing his envy and his vodka, watching her on television. Field later wrote that Reynolds tried to control her, to keep her small, so he could feel big. By the time we met, she said, the weight of his stardom had become a way for Burt to control everyone around him. And from the moment I walked through the door, it was a way to control me. The relationship collapsed under the weight of his ego. They broke up and got back together multiple times, a toxic cycle of passion and punishment. But by 1982, it was over for good. Field walked away to continue her ascent into acting royalty. Reynolds stayed on his ranch alone with his toys. He would later spend the rest of his life telling anyone who would listen that Sally Field was the love of his life. He would cry in interviews 40 years later, regretting the way he treated her. But regret is the ghost that haunts the house you burned down yourself. As 1982 drew to a close, Reynolds was still technically on top. The Cannonball Run had been a massive hit, but the cracks in the foundation were widening. The physical toll of the stunts was catching up to him. The pain in his back, his knees, and his jaw was constant. He began to rely on a vitamin cocktail to get through the day. It started with a Percodan here, a Valium there, just to take the edge off, just to sleep. But the vitamins were becoming a food group. His eyes were getting glassy. His temper was getting shorter. And the audience, the fickle beast that he had courted so successfully, was starting to get bored. A new generation of stars was rising. Tom Cruise was putting on sunglasses. Eddie Murphy was picking up a badge. The era of the good old boy was fading. Reynolds didn't see the cliff approaching. He was driving the Trans Am at 110 miles per hour, looking in the rearview mirror at the glory of the past, laughing that signature laugh. He thought the road went on forever. He was about to hit the wall. Years later, in an interview, Burt Reynolds was asked about the role of Han Solo. He paused, his face sagging with age, the toupee sitting heavily on his head. "I think I would have been a terrible Han Solo," he lied. But then the mask slipped. But God, imagine the toys, imagine the legacy. It wasn't the money he missed. He had made millions. It was the immortality. Han Solo is eternal. The Bandit was just a moment. By saying no to the Millennium Falcon, he grounded himself on Earth, destined to age, to break, and to be forgotten by the children of the future. The tragedy of Burt Reynolds isn't that he wasn't talented. It's that he was too afraid to let his talent take him to stars he couldn't control. By 1984, the party was over, but Burt Reynolds was the last one to leave the room. The confetti was stale, the champagne was flat, and the lights were being turned up, revealing the cracks in the walls that the shadows had hidden for so long. The Imperial era, that glorious run where he could put a cowboy hat on a monkey and open at number 1, was dissolving into a hangover of epic proportions. The Turning Point was not a bad review or a box office bomb, though there were plenty of those accumulating. It was a single, violent moment of physics. Reynolds had signed on to star in City Heat alongside Clint Eastwood. On paper, it was the dream team of the decade. The Bandit meets Dirty Harry. It was supposed to be a buddy comedy that would reignite Reynolds' fading star power. But on the very first day of filming, a stunt went horribly wrong. In a fight scene, Reynolds was struck in the face with a metal chair. It wasn't a prop chair made of balsa wood, it was real steel. The impact shattered his jaw. It destroyed his temporomandibular joint, TMJ. It also damaged his inner ear, affecting his balance. The pain was excruciating, a white-hot lance that never left his skull. But Reynolds, a prisoner of his own tough guy mythology, refused to stop. He didn't go to the hospital. He didn't shut down production. He chewed on painkillers and kept working. It was the football player mentality. Rub some dirt on it. Get back in the game. But the body keeps the score. The damage to his jaw was so severe that he could not open his mouth to eat solid food. For months he lived on a liquid diet. The man who had been the beefcake symbol of the 70s began to melt away. He lost 30 pounds, then 40. His cheeks hollowed out. His eyes sank into his skull. He looked like a ghost haunting his own clothes. This physical transformation coincided with a terrifying cultural moment in America, the height of the AIDS epidemic. In the mid-80s, rapid weight loss in a male celebrity triggered a specific panic-stricken rumor mill. Hollywood, a town fueled by gossip, decided that Burt Reynolds was dying of AIDS. The whispers started at parties and quickly screamed from the headlines of tabloids. "Burt's secret battle!" they shouted. The industry recoiled. Friends stopped calling. Producers found excuses to look the other way. Reynolds found himself isolated in his mansion, battling a debilitating addiction to halcyon, a sleeping pill he took to escape the pain, while the world wrote his obituary. He was too proud to explain the truth about his jaw. That felt like an admission of weakness, so he let the rumors fester. He became a pariah in the kingdom he used to rule. It took years to rebuild his health, but by the time he reemerged in the late 80s, the landscape had changed. He was no longer the alpha. He was a legacy act, a man trying to find his footing in a world that had moved on to Bruce Willis and Arnold Schwarzenegger. Desperate for a reboot, Reynolds looked for stability. He looked for a partner who understood the game. He found her in Lonnie Anderson. Lonnie Anderson was the blonde bombshell star of WKRP in Cincinnati. She was beautiful, polished, and carried herself with the glitzy perfection of a beauty queen. To the public, Burt and Lonnie were a match made in tabloid heaven. He was the king of the South. She was the queen of TV. They were the Ken and Barbie of the B-list. They married in 1988 at Reynolds' ranch in Florida. It was a spectacle of excess. There were helicopters buzzing overhead, paparazzi in the bushes, and a guest list that read like a who's who of 70s stardom. It looked like a fairy tale. For a brief moment, it seemed to work. They adopted a son, Quentin. Reynolds, finally a father in his 50s, poured all his unspent love into the boy. He was gentle, doting, determined to be the opposite of the cold, hard chief. He wanted to give Quentin the hugs he never got. The pictures of Burt holding his son are among the only images from this era where his smile reaches his eyes. But behind the closed doors of their Jupiter, Florida mansion, the fairy tale was a horror show. Reynolds and Anderson were oil and water. He was moody, messy, and prone to dark depressions, fueled by his pill addiction. She was a meticulous spender, obsessed with image and lifestyle. He would later claim she bought everything in threes, one to wear, one to wash, and one to throw away. She would claim he was physically volatile and emotionally abusive. The tension built for 5 years until in 1993, the dam broke. And when it broke, it unleashed a flood of sewage that captivated and disgusted the entire nation. The divorce of Burt Reynolds and Lonnie Anderson was not a legal proceeding. It was a nuclear war fought on the battlefield of the American media. It was the War of the Roses brought to life. Reynolds, his judgment clouded by rage and ego, fired the first shot. He served her papers abruptly. But then, in a move of catastrophic stupidity, he decided to take his case directly to the public. He went on television, he gave interviews, he called her a cheater, he called her a bad mother. He detailed their sex life or lack thereof, complaining to the world that they hadn't touched each other in 3 years. He thought he was being the honest hurt guy. He thought the public, his loyal fans, would rally behind the Bandit. He was wrong. The public watched a wealthy, powerful man tearing down the mother of his child on national television, and they recoiled. He looked petty. He looked cruel. He looked small. Lonnie Anderson, on the other hand, played the game masterfully. She stayed quiet. She let him rant. She wore white to court. She looked like the victim. The divorce destroyed what was left of Reynolds' reputation. He became a punchline. Late-night comedians feasted on his toupee, his anger, and his failing career. He was no longer the cool guy. He was the angry old uncle screaming at Thanksgiving dinner. And then came the financial apocalypse. Reynolds had spent money like it was water for 20 years. He owned a private jet, a helicopter, massive estates, racehorses, and a chain of restaurants called Burt's Place. He had an entourage on the payroll. He had never looked at a price tag. But the movies weren't making money anymore. The divorce settlement was brutal. Lonnie's lawyers picked his bones clean. In 1996, the unthinkable happened. Burt Reynolds, the man who had been the #1 box office star in the world, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. He owed $11 million. He owed the networks. He owed the banks. He owed his wig maker. The humiliation was total. He had to sell the ranch. He had to sell the horses. He had to sell the art. He watched as strangers walked through his home putting price tags on his memories. The chief in his head must have been screaming, "You failed. You lost it all." By the mid-90s, Reynolds was a caricature. He was appearing in direct-to-video movies with titles that sounded like parodies. He was doing commercials for orange juice. He was reduced to playing Burt Reynolds in cameos, a sad echo of his former self. By then, Hollywood had branded him difficult. There were rumors, counter-rumors, and a constant haze of gossip. But what wasn't rumor was the toll of pain and medication on his day-to-day life. He was sitting in a smaller house in Florida looking at his reflection. The face was lined. The hair was a system. The body was held together by titanium pins and Vicodin. He was 60 years old. But Burt Reynolds had one thing left. It was the thing Watson Duncan had seen in him 40 years earlier, before the fame, before the Trans Am, before the ego. He had talent, deep, raw, undeniable talent. He just needed one person brave enough to look past the toupee and see the actor underneath. That person was a young, brash filmmaker named Paul Thomas Anderson. He was making a movie about the porn industry in the 1970s. He needed someone to play Jack Horner, a porn director who sees himself as an artist. He needed someone who understood the era, someone who understood the seduction of fame, and someone who carried the sadness of a lost kingdom in his eyes. He sent the script of Boogie Nights to Burt Reynolds. Reynolds read it, and in true Burt Reynolds fashion, he threw it across the room. "It's filth," he shouted. "I'm not doing a movie about porn." He hated the script. He hated the character. He hated the young director who looked like a teenager. He said no. He said no 7 times. But the universe, having dragged him through the mud for a decade, was not going to let him miss his redemption. Paul Thomas Anderson was persistent. He begged, he pleaded, he flew to Florida. He told Reynolds, "You are the only man who can play this role." Reluctantly, bitterly, and purely for the paycheck, Reynolds agreed. He walked onto the set of Boogie Nights in 1997, hating every minute of it. He fought with the director. He mocked the young cast. By some accounts, tensions on set got so bad that Reynolds nearly came to blows with Anderson. He was a nightmare. He didn't know it, but he was delivering the performance of his life. He wasn't acting anymore. He was Jack Horner, a man holding onto a dying dream, surrounded by children, trying to maintain his dignity in a dirty business. The sadness on screen wasn't a choice. It was the accumulated weight of the last 15 years of his life. The cameras rolled, the bandit was dead, but the actor was about to be reborn. And the irony, the cruel, beautiful irony, was that the role he hated most would be the one that finally made the world love him again. During the filming of Boogie Nights, there is a scene where Jack Horner sits silently, watching his family of porn stars self-destruct at a New Year's Eve party. The camera holds on Reynolds' face for a long, uncomfortable time. There is no dialogue. In his eyes, you can see the ghosts of Dinah Shore, the ghost of Sally Field, the ghost of Lonnie Anderson, and the ghost of the son he tried so hard to be a hero for. You see the regret of the roles turned down and the pain of the jaw that never healed. It is a moment of pure, unadulterated grief. When the director yelled, "Cut," the crew didn't applaud. They were too stunned. They realized they weren't looking at a has-been. They were looking at a lion in winter, wounded, scarred, but majestic in his suffering. Reynolds stood up, smoothed his jacket, and walked to his trailer, still convinced he was making the worst movie of his life. He had forgotten that sometimes the most beautiful art comes from the ugliest pain. In the winter of 1997, Burt Reynolds stood on the red carpet for the premiere of Boogie Nights, flashing that familiar $1,000,000 smile. To the cameras, he looked like a phoenix rising from the ashes of bankruptcy and B-movies. But inside, he was seething. He hated the movie. He hated the director, Paul Thomas Anderson. And most of all, he hated the character he saw on the screen, Jack Horner, a weary, aging porn director clinging to a bygone era of artistic smut. Reynolds saw Jack Horner as a humiliation, a pathetic mirror image of his own decline. But the critics saw something else. They saw a revelation. They saw the soul of a great actor finally stripped of the toupee-wearing, gum-chewing persona. They called it the comeback of the century. The cognitive dissonance was deafening. Reynolds fired his agent for making him do the movie. He almost punched the director in the face during filming. Yet here he was, being showered with the kind of praise he hadn't heard since Deliverance. The awards season of 1998 was a surreal victory lap. He won the Golden Globe for Best Supporting Actor. In his acceptance speech, he looked frail but dignified, a lion in winter acknowledging that the jungle had changed. "I've been very lucky," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've had a hell of a run." Then came the Academy Awards. He was the favorite. The narrative was perfect. The fallen king returns to claim his crown. Reynolds walked into the Shrine Auditorium convinced that this was it. The validation he had sought from his father, from the industry, from the serious actors who had mocked him. It was all about to be delivered in the form of a golden statue. The envelope was opened. And the Oscar goes to, the pause felt like a lifetime, Robin Williams for Good Will Hunting. The camera cut to Reynolds. For a split second, the mask slipped. You could see the air leave his body. He clapped a slow, heavy clap, but the light behind his eyes went out. He had lost. The industry had dangled immortality in front of him and then yanked it away at the last second. That night, something in Burt Reynolds finally broke for good. He didn't fight for better roles after that. He didn't try to work with the Scorseses or the Spielbergs. He retreated. He went back to what was comfortable: bad movies, easy paychecks, and the safety of being a caricature. The 2000s were a long, slow slide into irrelevance. He appeared in the remake of The Longest Yard with Adam Sandler playing the old coach. It was a passing of the torch, but it felt more like a surrender. He looked stiff, his movements restricted by the back surgery and the years of stunt abuse. He was playing the grandfather to a generation that only knew him as a meme, not as a god. His health began to fail in spectacular, painful ways. The years of throwing himself off buildings and crashing cars came back to collect the debt. He underwent back surgery, neck surgery, and a quintuple heart bypass. He was in constant pain. The man who had once posed naked on a bearskin rug was now frail, walking with a cane, his body a map of scars. And then the final indignity: the money ran out. Again. In 2014, facing foreclosure on his Florida estate, Burt Reynolds did the unthinkable. He organized an auction. He wasn't just selling furniture, he was selling his life. The catalog was a heartbreaking inventory of a lost empire. The red jacket from Smokey and the Bandit, the canoe from Deliverance, Rolodexes filled with the phone numbers of dead stars, and, most devastating of all, the Golden Globe he had won for Boogie Nights. Fans and collectors descended like vultures. They bought pieces of him for pennies on the dollar. Reynolds put a brave face on it. "I'm just downsizing," he told the press. "I want to share these things with the fans." But the image of a 78-year-old legend selling his own trophies to pay the mortgage was a grim reminder of how cruel Hollywood can be to its elderly. He spent his final years in Jupiter, Florida, teaching acting classes. It was a quiet, almost monastic existence. He would sit in a chair surrounded by students who looked at him with awe, and he would tell them stories about the old days, about Bette Davis, about Johnny Carson, about the time he swam a river in Georgia and lived to tell the tale. He preached the importance of the work, the very thing he had so often neglected in favor of the fame. But destiny had one last twist in store, a final almost. In 2018, Quentin Tarantino was casting his masterpiece, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. The film was a love letter to the Hollywood of 1969, the exact era when Burt Reynolds had been a young, hungry TV actor. Tarantino wanted Reynolds to play George Spahn, the blind, crusty owner of the ranch where the Manson family lived. It was perfect. It was the role that would bring everything full circle. It was gritty, it was real, and it was in a movie that would be seen by the world. Reynolds said yes. He was excited. He was 82 years old, frail and thin, but the fire was back. He began rehearsing. He sat with his assistant, running lines, trying to find the voice of the character. He was preparing for his comeback. He was preparing to remind the world one last time who he was. On September 6, 2018, Burt Reynolds was in his home, running lines for the Tarantino movie. He felt a pain in his chest. He went to the bathroom, and he fell. He died of a cardiac arrest before he ever stepped on the set. He died working. He died preparing. He died with a script in his hand, still chasing the next scene, still believing that the best take was the next one. The news of his death triggered a wave of global nostalgia. The world suddenly remembered how much they loved him. They remembered the laugh. They remembered the mustache. They remembered the way he winked at the camera, letting us all in on the joke. But the tragedy of Burt Reynolds is not that he died, it's that he died with so much music left in him. He was a man who spent his life running away from his own depth, terrified that if he showed the world his pain, they would stop loving him. He built a fortress of charm, but he died a prisoner inside it. If you go to the Hollywood Forever Cemetery today, you will find his grave. It is a modest marker for a man who lived such an immodest life. But the real monument to Burt Reynolds isn't in stone. It's in the rearview mirror of American culture. He represents a time that is gone and never coming back. A time when movie stars were dangerous, when cars were loud, and when a man could conquer the world with nothing but a smile and a full tank of gas. Somewhere, in the great celestial cinema, maybe there is a version of The Godfather where he plays Sonny. Maybe there is a version of Star Wars where he pilots the Falcon. But down here, on Earth, we are left with the movies he actually made and the bittersweet memory of the man who was the bandit. He drove fast. He laughed hard. And in the end, he outran everything except his own heart. The road goes on forever, but the bandit has finally pulled over